I started working at 13 to prove my worth, while my sister was given everything. When my parents tried to take my savings for her cosmetic surgeries and my grandfather intervened, the whole family blew up. My family is complicated. You could call it patriarchal, but it's more deeply problematic. All my life, as an 18-year-old male, I've been held to an impossible standard just for being a boy. Meanwhile, my older sister, Grace, who's 25, has always been showered with endless love and attention, simply because she's the eldest and because she's a girl. I honestly can't stand her, and she barely acknowledges my existence. It's always been this way, and I imagine it always will be. I don't really mind, though. Grace is insufferable, and there's a good reason she doesn't have a single friend. No one, apart from our parents, can tolerate her for more than 6 months. The longest anyone, friend or boyfriend, has ever stuck by her side is half a year. And frankly, I don't blame them. Even 6 months with Grace is an achievement. The worst part is, she's so completely oblivious. She genuinely doesn't understand that she's the problem. She's been raised to believe she can do no wrong, that everyone else is against her, and that she has every right to cut anyone out of her life who doesn't treat her like royalty. Well, tough luck, because the real world doesn't operate that way. All this entitlement stems directly from our parents' enabling behavior. They dote on Grace beyond reason, to the point where my younger sister, Kelsey, who's 14, and I sometimes feel like we're just decorative props, and they only ever wanted one child. But I'm so grateful to have Kelsey. I love her more than anyone else in the world, and I desperately want her to escape this toxic environment as soon as possible, especially since our parents actively encourage Grace's behavior and try to pressure Kelsey into emulating her. I know if Kelsey turns out like Grace, she won't accomplish anything meaningful in life. She's too young to be molded into a carbon copy, and I absolutely refuse to let that happen. It's a huge relief that her personality is the complete opposite of Grace's, so she naturally doesn't have that tendency to act like the queen of the house. I know it's solely up to me to shield her from the ridiculous and outdated beliefs my family holds about everything. From the time I was a kid, I was taught I was the man of the house and destined to take over my dad's business as an adult. It was drilled into me early on that being a man meant shouldering endless responsibilities, being serious all the time, and earning money to provide for the family. That's just what the men in my family did. I never questioned it, so I internalized it all. However, the push to start earning my own money began incredibly early. My father declared he wouldn't hand me any opportunities on a silver platter. He said he'd only offer financial assistance for college if I could prove I was worthy of his help. I had to demonstrate my worth as a man to him, and this was all happening when I was just a child. I vividly remember this lecture before my 11th birthday, after I asked my dad if I could have friends over for a party. He told me I was becoming a young man and needed to become aware of the world's responsibilities, casting aside childishness. I wish I hadn't listened to him then, but I didn't know any better. I picked up my first job at 13. It wasn't much, but I enjoyed it. Initially, I walked neighborhood dogs, and then I started dog sitting. I've always loved animals, and because I started so young, I developed the skills, the knack, and most importantly, the patience for that kind of work. It provided me with some spending money, but most of it I saved. My parents were proud, which in turn made me proud of myself. They never asked what I did with the money or how much I made. Their only concern was ensuring I wasn't spending it on dangerous things like alcohol or drugs. They'd routinely check my room, but never found anything, because I never developed those habits. I meticulously stashed my earnings, saving it all up for college. I was naive back then, thinking this money would be enough for tuition, which it clearly wasn't. Plus, I was pretty sure my father wouldn't contribute a dime to my education, especially after he'd already told me the only way I'd get financial assistance from him was if I proved my worth. The problem with this kind of indoctrination is that I never felt worthy of my dad's money. I still don't. This experience stands in stark contrast to Grace's daily life. She has never faced any of these struggles. The only things ever expected of her were to look pretty and to marry well. Those were her sole requirements. This was instilled in her from a young age. I guess because I don't recall her ever trying to excel in school or pursue hobbies beyond makeup or dressing up. I still remember when I was barely 10, we had to go to my dad's friend's house, and Grace had a fever. She wasn't dressed up, and my parents were horrified. To them, a normally dressed Grace was preferable to a sick one. She asked to skip the party because she felt unwell, but they forced her to go, insisting we'd only be there for a little while. I think she might have had her own struggles with them, but it only made her insufferable instead of a decent person. They've tried to put Kelsey through the same thing, but I've been doing my absolute best to prevent her from falling for it. Besides, with all of Grace's drama happening every other week, they're too preoccupied with her to bother much with us. A few weeks ago, an issue erupted that I never imagined would blow up into something so significant. I'm not complaining, because I finally feel vindicated after all these years, but it's still strange to see the family at each other's throats. It all started when I got into one of the best universities in my state for undergrad, and I was incredibly proud. I also secured a full scholarship, so financial aid wasn't an issue. Mom and Dad were proud of me too. Dad even said I'd worked very hard and he was proud. I rarely hear those words, so they meant a lot. However, what he said next completely stunned me. He told me that since I had a scholarship, I could work and pay for my living costs. I was pretty bummed because I'd been working since I was 13, partly hoping that Dad would eventually help me out since I'd shown him I was responsible. I had hoped my late teens at least would be enjoyable, as I'd spent every other part of my youth slaving away at school or working. He claimed he'd been training me for the trials of life ever since I was a boy. There were no trials. I could have had a very comfortable life. I was sullen for a while, but I decided to talk to Dad about it. I hoped he'd understand. Even if he didn't, the worst that could happen was he'd yell at me. It didn't matter. I desperately needed rest, a break, and a life. I went to him and explained that I'd been working since childhood, only because he'd promised to help me with college if I proved myself responsible with money and worthy of his investment. I told him I didn't know how else one could prove their worth, and I'd tried my best all these years. I told him I was exhausted from working and wanted to have a good college experience. I asked him to help with living costs. I had a significant sum saved from all those years of work, but I explained it wouldn't cover all my expenses, which is why I needed his help. He just sighed, looking utterly defeated. He said he understood my perspective, but couldn't do much right now because Grace was going through a lot. I completely lost it. I told him Grace was always going through a lot. He'd always favored her over me. He'd paid for all her extravagant clothes and makeup. He'd funded both her weddings out of his own pocket. And for what? For her to be dumped by her husband's because she was an idiotic ass with no personality beyond being a stupid Barbie doll. Dad looked exasperated, saying there was nothing he could do but help her because she was in a very bad place. This bad place refers to her 2 divorces. Her first husband was Luke, my dad's friend's son, a few years older than her. They married when she was 20 and he was 28, and he was done with her within a year. I don't know the specifics of the divorce. I was very young and thankfully kept out of it. All I know is Dad and his friend are still on good terms, but Dad has been annoyed with Grace ever since. She married again 2 years ago to a guy nobody in the family liked. His name is Andrew or Andy, and he just gave everyone the creeps. I have no idea what she saw in him besides his money, because he was loaded. That part was true, but he was just weird and disgusting. So much so that even my parents disliked him, which was surprising, because they usually like anyone with money. That marriage also went south. He was a serial cheater. He knew he could get away with it because Grace was obsessed with the money and luxury, so he knew how to silence her. Mom and Dad never liked him anyway and tried to convince her to leave him, but she never listened. She insisted she couldn't bear another failed marriage and would make it work no matter what it took. Well, what it took was another woman he got pregnant and left Grace for, so she came back home. That was a year ago, and she's been home ever since. It's been horrible for me, and especially for Kelsey. Now that my parents have realized their project has failed and Grace couldn't achieve what they wanted, they've started focusing on Kelsey. They tried to get her to listen to them, but I've done my job well. I've coached her on how to avoid their manipulation because I know their tactics inside out. Grace, for her part, is utterly miserable. And honestly, I don't really want to pull her out of her misery. I know being divorced twice by 25 is a lot for anyone, but I simply can't bring myself to feel bad for her. I never have, and I don't think I ever will. Anyway, Dad told me his current focus was Grace because of her 2 failed marriages, and he had to do something about her, meaning all attention would once again be on her. In hindsight, I don't know why I was even surprised or why he expected me to be understanding. I wanted to scream at him then, but I figured it was pointless. And then he said something that made all that simmering rage inside me explode. He told me that since I knew how bad things were for Grace, and because I had a full ride to university and was practically sorted, he wanted me to give all my hard-earned money to him so he could use it for Grace. And for what? Cosmetic surgeries. Because she felt her husband's left her because she wasn't pretty enough. I have never heard a more ridiculous proposition in my life. I'd never felt so much anger before. I would have slapped my father that day. Honestly, I don't know how I didn't. I started screaming. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I know it wasn't sweet or kind. It was nasty. I ranted the entire time because I simply couldn't believe his audacity. I told him he had ruined my entire childhood with his stupid notions, and that he had failed both Grace and me. I told him Grace was an unemployable little piece of work because they never allowed her to develop any personality or hobbies beyond being beautiful and finding a husband. That's why they now felt guilty about how her life turned out, and they'd pander to her every whim and fancy as the only way to alleviate their guilt. I told him there was no way in hell I was letting him touch a single penny of my money, especially not for Grace's glow-ups. He was surprisingly calm and said he understood my frustration, but that now was the time for me to stand by my family and do the right thing. I shot back that I had been led by example, and if he had never done the right thing by me, I didn't know how he could expect me to. I'd never witnessed the right thing in my family, only favoritism and partiality. And if he expected me to just let go of all that, it wasn't going to happen. I told him I was a fool to ever expect him to help me, and similarly, he was a fool to believe I'd give any money to Grace. I then stormed out of the room and broke down. I was so frustrated. Logically, I knew that if I did end up taking a job, I'd be able to survive and thrive in college. But to hell with logic. I was just broken at that point. The realization finally hit home. No matter what I did, no matter what I achieved or how I behaved, I was never going to be worthy enough for my family. We had 2 children in that house. One was a young woman who never excelled in school, married twice and divorced twice. She never had to lift a finger or want for anything. And she had one job, according to my parents, stay married. She couldn't even do that. On the other hand, there was me. I don't even remember the last time I was stress-free or truly happy. I was always either studying, working, or looking for work. More than the money. It was about proving to my parents, especially my dad, that I was a good kid, that I was doing what they wanted, hoping for their love in return. But that never happened, and I now know it never will. Grace is their favorite, and nothing on earth can change that. So I knew I had to do something, and fast, to save both myself and Kelsey. I didn't know who to turn to. I knew talking to my uncles would be useless. They'd only offer sympathy, and if they tried to talk to Dad, he'd just dismiss them, and it would all reflect poorly on me. The only people who could talk sense into my dad, and whom he actually listened to, were my grandparents. I knew they were the only ones who could put an end to this crap. And by this point, I didn't even want Dad's money. I'd reconciled myself to funding my entire way through college. Now I wanted justice. I wanted the world to know what truly happened behind these closed doors and expose my father for who he really was. Little did I know that one call to my grandfather would change everything so dramatically. Had I known the kind of influence Grandpa had over Dad, I would have called him years ago to put a stop to all this. I called Grandpa and told him everything, leaving out no detail. Not even the part where I worked only because I wanted to prove myself to my parents. Apparently, they had been telling everyone that I was working because I wanted to, and that they had tried to stop me many times, but I was adamant and never listened. I told him about the scholarship and Dad's refusal to help with living expenses. And finally, I told him about Grace's planned cosmetic surgeries that Dad wanted me to fund. It was a long, difficult call, and I suspected Grandpa hadn't fully grasped all of it. He told me to calm down and that he wanted to meet me in person to discuss it. I agreed. We met at his place the next day, about an hour away, and I repeated everything. He didn't interrupt and didn't say much. When I finished, he simply asked what I wanted, and I said I wasn't sure. But I was sick of the bias and neglect. He assured me I had nothing to worry about and that he would take care of everything. This was last week, and nothing has happened yet. Dad keeps trying to pressure me into giving him my money, and now he's enlisted Mom, who resorts to emotional blackmail. But I won't give in. I know Grandpa is going to show up, and I know he's going to blast the daylights out of Dad. I trust him, but now I just can't wait for it to happen. I need my vengeance, and I need my justice. So the big blow-up happened, and it was much worse, or rather much better, than I had expected. I honestly never thought things would come full circle like this. But hey, I'm not complaining in the slightest. My grandparents arrived and gathered the family. Dad probably thought it was just one of those regular meetings where we'd have lunch and then go our merry way. Boy, was he wrong. It started with Grandpa asking Dad what his plans were for Grace. Mom mumbled something, but Dad claimed she wanted to enroll in college and they were considering options for her. Everyone knew that was a lie, but Grandpa wasn't in the mood to play games. He directly asked Grace what courses and colleges she was looking at, but she had nothing to say. She just stared blankly at everyone, causing immense embarrassment. Dad's face turned completely red. Then Grandpa turned to me and asked about my college plans. I told him I had a full scholarship, but no help for living costs. He looked at Dad and made a disapproving face. Dad pretended not to see it. That's when Grandma stepped in. She asked Dad how much he was going to give me. Not if he was going to give me money, but only how much. Dad stammered that they hadn't discussed it yet. That's when I jumped in and said, actually, we had discussed it, and he had completely refused to help me out. Grace kicked me under the table, but I didn't care. This was all coming out. Dad started laughing nervously, claiming it was just silly banter between father and son, while my mother glared daggers at me. If looks could kill, I'd be 6 feet under, being eaten by insects right now. I retorted that it certainly didn't feel like banter to me, and I'd even been asked to hand over all my savings to fund Grace's cosmetic procedures. Grandpa slammed his hand on the table and asked Dad if it was true. I think Dad was too stunned to lie, and he immediately said yes. The entire room fell silent. Grandpa, bless his heart, gave a lingering, piercing look to every single person present. He has a flair for the dramatic, and it worked beautifully. He asked Dad why he was behaving that way, but Dad had no answer. He then turned to Mom and asked her how she was okay with such blatant partiality, but she also had nothing to say. He then stood up and declared that since the parents in this situation were choosing to remain silent, he had no choice but to take matters into his own hands. He stated that he had a significant inheritance, initially intended to be divided equally among us 3 grandchildren. But given that my parents were focusing all their energy and money on Grace and none on Kelsey or me, he was compelled to rethink this division. He announced that Grace would receive $30,000, while the remaining $270,000 would be divided equally between Kelsey and me. My jaw dropped. $135,000 is an insane amount of money. I never asked for this. I never told Grandpa I wanted more money. So I don't know why he made this decision, but when he said it, all hell broke loose. Grace immediately started yelling, complaining she never knew there was so much money available and that it was unfair she was getting peanuts while Kelsey and I received so much. Grandpa calmly told her that all her life she had been getting so much and Kelsey and I had been getting peanuts. But she hadn't protested then. Then Dad tried to interject, arguing this wasn't fair and Grandpa was discriminating among his grandchildren. But Grandma promptly cut in, saying they weren't discriminating, they were simply being fair. She added that Mom and Dad were the ones who started the discrimination and they were just trying to make things better and easier for the two other kids Mom and Dad treated like dirt. She also pointed out that none of this would have happened had they been good parents and understood how a family should function. Dad insisted there was no need to punish Grace for a crime she didn't commit and that she should have her full share. Grandpa was livid by then. He was still somewhat civil, but I think Dad's continuous self-defense and protection of Grace, without any apology, pushed Grandpa over the edge. He said that Dad was right, and I heard Grace breathe a sigh of relief beside me. Grandpa then declared that the real culprits were Mom and Dad, and poor old Grace was not to blame. Therefore, he announced that the inheritance due for Dad was now also going to Kelsey and me. I watched all the color drain from Dad's face. It was clear Dad hadn't anticipated this, but too bad for him because Grandpa had thought it all through. Dad quietly protested that Grandpa couldn't do that, and Grandpa simply said, "Watch me." It was a dead serious, utterly badass move, and honestly, that man has my complete respect. He said he had nothing more to say and that he would be leaving. He also sternly warned Dad not to harass or manipulate either Kelsey or me, as we were not to blame. He had done what he believed was right, and if Dad tried to mess with us, Grandpa said he could go a lot lower. I think Dad is genuinely terrified because he hasn't said a single word to us since Grandpa left. Kelsey is young and doesn't fully grasp everything that happened, but I know Dad is petrified that Grandpa will follow through. Mom has been trying to talk to me, but I just avoid her like I've done my entire childhood. Now, suddenly I'm the hot topic of the family and everyone is trying to butter me up, even Grace. I told her to get lost because she was the last person I wanted to talk to. I'm just so glad Grandpa has taken action. And now, they're finally going to face the consequences of their actions. As for me, that's a lot of money, and I know I'm set for life with that kind of head start. As of now, I don't have to worry about college, and I don't have to worry about life after college either. My life has shifted dramatically since then, and I've even left for college. Leaving home was bittersweet. Kelsey hugged me and cried, and I cried too. I know it's going to be very difficult for her, and I know my parents will try to manipulate her. I've told her to tell me everything that happens in the house, and she's promised she will. I can only hope I can do enough to save her and prevent her from being brainwashed by the idiots I have to call my parents. Grandpa said I could use part of my inheritance for living costs, and I'm very grateful to him. I told him I would probably still take up a job, because for me, it wasn't really about the money. It was more about the lack of acceptance and the neglect I faced from my parents. All that rage was rooted in that. He said he respected my decision and that I was much more of a man than his own son. But he also said he wanted me to enjoy life because responsibilities and duties will always burden me. So we reached an agreement. I'll try working, and if it strains me or doesn't work out, I won't hesitate to reach for that inheritance, because it's rightfully mine. I thanked him, and both of us teared up a little. I don't think I'll end up using the inheritance, and I don't even mind working. It just feels good to have someone support me, to have someone to count on financially, and more than that, psychologically. I guess I've missed this feeling my entire life, and it's all very overwhelming for me now. I won't be updating anymore, as I'm starting a new phase of my life away from home, and I want to keep the resentment at bay as much as possible. Hopefully, I won't need to post again,